I'm your huckleberry.
Hey, yo, lesson here, babe. You come at the king, you best not miss.
Sometimes I think I might have to go through this whole book, which is something that I probably didn't intend on doing because I have other books I probably need to go through. Um, but while we're here, and since I had to go through one chapter already, I said I might as well go through another one. And this is a chapter that caught my eye. It's called the Matriarchy, if I'm actually pronouncing it right. Is Matriarch hate or Matriarch 8? Whatever. Okay, so let's get into the book. This is coming from um, E. Franklin Frazier's The Negro Family. Only women accustomed to playing the dominant role in family and marriage relations, if we may regard slaves as having been married, would have asserted themselves as the Negro woman in Mississippi did during the election of 1868. If a freedman having obtained a picture of Grant lacked the courage to wear it at home, I'm talking about General Grant, on the plantation in the presence of old Massa and Mrs. or of the overseer, his wife would often take it from him and bravely wear it upon her own breast. If in such cases the husband refused to surrender it, as was sometimes the case, and hid it from her or locked it up, she would walk all the way to town, and as many as 20 or 30 miles sometimes, and buy, beg, or borrow one, and thus equipped return and wear it openly in defiance of husband, master, mistress, or overseer. Even back then, Black women were bold because most black women knew they weren't going to hang you or kill you. Uh, but that's an aside. These women had doubtless been schooled in self-reliance and self-sufficiency during slavery. As a rule, the Negro woman, as wife or mother, was the mistress of her cabin, and save for the interference of master or overseer, her wishes in regard to mating and family matters were paramount. This is the beginning of the Gynocracy, in my opinion. Neither economic necessity nor tradition had instilled in her the spirit of subordination to masculine authority. This is in the 1930s, the mid 1930s when he wrote this book. Emancipation only tended to confirm in many cases the spirit of self-sufficiency which slavery had taught. When emancipation came, many Negro mothers had to depend on their own efforts for support of themselves. That's very true. And their children. Their ranks were swelled by other women in seeking sex gratification outside of marriage, found themselves in a similar situation. Without the assistance of a husband or the father of their children, these women were forced to return to the plow or the white man's kitchen in order to make a livelihood for their families. That's very true. In fact, W. Du Bois said coming out of slavery, a black woman had three choices. She was either working a sweatshop, being a washerwoman or a seamstress. Um, she was a cook or something like that, or she was a wife. She only had three choices. So this is very true. From that time to the present day, as we have seen in the preceding chapter, each generation of women following in the footsteps of their mothers has borne a large share of the support of the younger generation. Today, in the rural sections of the South, Especially on the remnants of the old plantation, one finds households where old grandmothers rule their daughters and grandchildren with matriarchal authority. Sometimes their authority dates back from the days following an emancipation. In wandering about the country, they found their first child. In other words, they children are actually very valuable once you're raised because they're actually labor. So black people have the tradition of picking up children or orphans that don't have any parents and actually adopting them, literally adopting them unofficially into the fold. I've heard many stories about that. It is, of course, difficult to get a precise measure of the extent of the maternal households in the Negro population. The 1930 census showed a larger proportion of families with women heads among Negroes than among whites in both rural and urban areas. In other words, um, as far as black people are concerned, the census was never particularly accurate. Moreover, it also appeared that in the cities, a larger proportion of Negro families were under the authority of the women than in the rural areas. In the rural non-farm areas of the southern states, from 15 to 25% of the Negro families were without male heads. Now, this is a footnote. In the 1930 census gave an enumeration of families with women heads. The general situation in regard to Negro families may be briefly summarized as follows. The proportion of families with women heads is higher in the South than in the North or the West. In all three sections, it is higher in urban areas than either rural farm or rural non-farm areas. It is higher among tenants than among owners in the urban areas, but shows the opposite tendency in rural areas, and is lowest in the rural farm areas of the North and the West. In other words, very difficult to run a farm without a man, without male labor. Very difficult. So to me, that makes sense. And it's going to make more sense as we go through the chapter. While in the rural farm areas, the proportion ranged from 3 to 15%. In the rural farm areas, tenant families had a much smaller proportion with women heads than owners, except in those states where a modified form of plantation regime is the dominant type of farming. For example, in the rural farm area of Alabama, between 13 and 14% of both tenant and owner families were without male heads, although rural areas showed a smaller proportion of families without male heads than urban areas. Still, it is the rural areas of the South that we find the maternal family functioning in its most primitive form as a natural organization. If you read the Briefalt's book about the families or the mother, he says the most primitive form of the natural organization is around the mother and child. That is the first family, basically. In as a group. But the mother and child is the first nuclear family, but that blends with the whole clan. You can't have mother and child by themselves, otherwise they'll die. In spite of the fact that official statistics on the marital relations of these women are of doubtful accuracy, a closer view of the census materials on the families in three southern counties in 1910 and 1920 throws additional light on the extent of character of these maternal households in this region. Table 1 indicates that from a fifth to a fourth of the families in three counties, two in the Black Belt and a third in the coastal region, were without a male head. I'm going to skip some of the footnotes to save time. I don't feel like going through the footnotes. I may later. The Negro family in the U.S. Okay, in each of the counties in 1910, the families in which a wife was a mulatto had a smaller proportion without a male head than families with a black wife or mother. You can pause it and glance at the table if you would like. In fact, if you want to read the footnotes, you can actually read it for yourself, pause it and read it for yourself. Smaller proportions of families without a male head among the mulattoes was doubtless due to the relatively higher economic and cultural status of this class, which had less illiteracy but a higher rate of home ownership than the blacks in the 1920s. Than the 1920. I'm gonna pause so you guys can actually look at the footnote and read it for yourself. In the 1920, the mulattoes in the North Carolina county still showed a smaller proportion of families without male heads, while in the Black Belt counties, the standing of the mulattoes was reversed in one instance and was the same as the blacks in the other. The migrations during the war might have been responsible for the change in the relative position of the two classes in the Black Belt counties. Since the population of both counties decreased between 1910 and 1920, this much at least is true. The increase in the proportion of families without a male head among the mulattoes in the latter counties was accompanied by a decrease in the number of home-owning families among this class. We can get a better conception of the relation of home ownership to stable and normal family relations by examining the marital status of these women, who are heads of families. Although our figures are not absolutely accurate, he admits that, they reveal much to a greater extent the real nature of the conjugal relations of these women than the published statistics. We have, in addition, two usual classifications. Widowed and divorced. Two others. Women who apparently had been married but were separated from their husbands. Take a look at the chart. See for yourself. I'm not going to read it. And women who had only irregular relations with men. For example, we find that Issaquah County, Mississippi, in 1910, of the 671 women heads of families, 159 or 21% were separated from their husbands, and 66 or about 10% had only irregular relations with men. In Hertford County, North Carolina, for the same year, 14.1% of the women heads of families were separated, and 34.6% had only irregular relations with men. While separated and the irregular unions each comprised about 14% of the women heads of families in Macon County, Alabama, after allowance for the separated and those who had only irregular associations with men, the majority of these women are classified as widows. Now remember when he talked about desertion or men deserting, he said these women were not widows, or they're not separated, or they're not divorced. Remember that. Now here he's saying something else. The thing is that chapter is actually later in this book. After making allowance for separated and those who are only irregular association with these men, the majority of these women are classified as widows. This is true of blacks as well as the mulattoes, and of tenants as well as homeowners. But an important difference appears between the women who own their homes, and those who are renters, or whose home tenure is unknown. Among the homeowners, from 80 to 100% of the women are included under widowhood, whereas for the renters and those of unknown tenure, from 50 to 70% were in this class. This is true of both the blacks and the mulattoes, and seems to indicate that widowhood among homeowners was generally real widowhood. That's not necessarily true. And say, okay, we're going to actually read this one. See Table 5, Appendix B, concerning the accuracy of statistics on widow in the federal enumeration of 1900. The Census Bureau states that among 1,000 Negroes at least 15 years of age, 345 are single, 539 are married, while 1,000 whites of the same age, 14 more are single, and 20 more are white or married. total difference of 34 being almost balanced by the, well, we'll get to that later. That these figures represent more truly the conjugal relations of these women than published statistics is apparent from the histories of their marital experience. The divorced and in some cases widowed in published statistics are often in fact merely separations, since divorce is regarded by many of these people as an individual affair and not requiring legal look at this. Where my pen at? Where is my pen? I was just talking about this to Brother Lowcast. Let me highlight this for you. Whip my pen out. Since divorce is regarded by many of these people as an individual affair, not requiring legal sanction. I've seen this in my own life. Okay, I've seen this amongst people in my own life. As we shall see below, divorce in one case consisted of giving a man a script On the whole, these simple folk have vague notions concerning the legal requirements for divorce. One man said that he did not need a divorce from his wife because she was in one county and me in another. Another man considered himself divorced when his wife was sentenced to jail for cutting a woman. Many of the women who were heads of families have been married, in some cases often married, they have often broken marital ties and remained remarried without a legal divorce. On a plantation in Alabama, a woman near 60 who worked a one-horse farm with her son recounted the story of her 3 marriages. Her father, who had been raised up under the hard task of slavery, had sent her as far as the 4th grade. Then her marriage career began. Of the first 2 husbands, she said, me and him separated and he divorced me. Me and the second one got married and come down here. Then he fought me when this boy, her son, was 6 months old. We fought like cats and dogs. One night I had to call Uncle RP. He asked me for his divorce, and I gave it to him. I just wrote a script. I got a man to write it for him. Her third husband, who had been dead 7 years, died, according to her testimony, of high blood pressure, leakage of the heart, and kidney trouble. Sounds about right. Another old woman had a similar story to tell, when she announced, all my children done married off. She is speaking of 2 sets of children, one by her husband and another by the man with whom she lived after having divorced her husband. According to her story, her husband had told her that he wanted a divorce, and she replied that he was welcome to it. But as to the reason of the breaking of the marriage bond, she explained, he didn't work to suit me and I didn't work to suit him. See, this is the part that's not told. A lot of this stuff the separation and divorce or stuff like that, where legally the man leaving is considered desertion. This is the stuff that actually really goes on. The last naive statement concerning divorce reveals much in regard to the nature of marriage and its dissolution amongst these simple folks. Among these people, we come face to face with marriage as it probably existed in the early stages of social development, which is very true. Marriage as an institution rooted in the mores does not exist in many places and has developed any degree of permanency, and the couples are seemingly bound by conjugal affection. More fundamental interests than mere sentiment have been responsible in the beginning for the continuance of the association in marriage. When one woman was asked whether she was married, her reply was, me and my husband parted so long, done forgot I was married. What marriage means to many of these women was expressed by a woman who spoke of herself as Miss, although she has been married twice and wanted another husband to help her work. Her first husband, whom she married, was 15. He was killed by lightning after they had been together 12 years. Her second husband had been dead 2 years, and at present she was making a living by hoeing and fertilizing on a place that she said they tells me it was here in slavery times. Her only idea indicating preference in regard to a husband was that he must be dark, for if he is most too light, he looks too much like the white folks. But the main factor in regard to the partner in marriage was that he should cooperate with her in farming, as she remarked. I'm looking for someone to marry so I can get a farm and kind of rest. She had hoped that her son in Cleveland, who had served in France during the war, would relieve her from going into the field each day in the hot sun, but he had written he was sick and she sent for him to come home. Where marriage is regarded as chiefly as means of cooperation, and task of making a living does not rest upon an institutional basis. It is not surprising to find some of these women speaking of working with a man as a sufficient basis of living together. This was the explanation offered by a illiterate buxom black woman of 40 or more who had been farming right around 25 acres for 2 years with a man who was separated from his wife a quarter of a mile away because they just couldn't get along and separated. She had had several children without being married, the only living one being cared for by her mother. But some of these cases of irregular unions are not the result of the naive behavior of simple folk. We have seen in the preceding chapter how in one case both parents of the unmarried mother and the unmarried mother herself attempted to represent a man in the house as a boarder. Wherever we find these consciousness of violation of the dominant mores or a certain sophistication, the couples will attempt to represent their union as something socially approved, a relationship, or as a conventional marriage. Get it? Got it? Good. This was the case with a brick mason, 47, who had been educated at Tuskegee Institute. He was living with a woman, 22, on a patch of 5 acres for which they were paying $60 rental a year. The woman was a mulatto who thought that she had some Indian blood. Her mother was farming with 8 children. That's a footnote. Go ahead and read it for yourself. I'm not going to read it here. While her father had deserted the mother and gone to Detroit, this irregular union was especially convenient for the man since it was outside the public opinion and censure of the group with whom he spent much of his time in town. Some of these irregular unions are due to the association between white men and colored women. The prevalence of these associations is determined by several factors. They are found more frequently in small towns of the South than in the isolated rural regions where large numbers of Negroes have been concentrated for nearly a century or longer. The proportion of mulattoes in the Negro population is the measure of isolation of the Negro and of the amount of contacts between the races. In Sequana County, in the Yazoo, Mississippi basin, only 10% of the families were mulattoes in 1910. While in the Hertford County in North Carolina, 40% of the family showed mixed blood. In Hertford County, where in 1910 we have seen about 35% of women who were heads of families had irregular relations with men. The association between white men and colored women continued on a large scale for a long period after slavery. Can we say swirling, boys and girls? These irregular unions were generally formed by white men and mulatto women. According to our figures, 28 of the 108 women heads of families who carried in irregular relations were mulattoes. See, 28 of 108. The change in these figures is indicative of an actual decrease in these types of associations. For in this community, there has been a conscious effort on the part of colored population to repress such associations and enforce conventional standards of conduct. In other words, you can't go around sleeping with white folks. That's where it comes from. So black folks started to separate back then too. A minister who established a school in this county and has worked there nearly half a century related the following concerning these associations where he began to work there. When I first came here, I often heard that mulatto women say that oh man, I wonder if this particular woman is the ancestor of Crystal Kerrison. I'm gonna go ahead and read it. When I first came here, I often heard mulatto women say that they would rather be a white man's concubine than a nigger's wife. The mulatto women and white men claimed that since the law did not allow them to marry, they had only one wife and that it was all right. Conflict almost broke up P&P Baptist Church. There was a scattering of families, many going north and passing for white. In other words, they left and actually blended in because in their hometowns they knew who they were. So the white man took his family and went north and passed his wife for white. The feeling was such between mulattoes and blacks that they wanted me to place the mulattoes on a second floor and the blacks on the third floor in the school dormitory. I mixed them up in school purposely and got black evangelists for the church. Although frequently the white man was not married and lived with his mulatto concubine as his wife, this was not invariably the case. It is also true that in many instances, the economic advantages which these mulatto families enjoyed were due to the provision which the white father had made for his concubine and his mulatto children. In the following document, which was furnished by a woman who was born before emancipation, we have the case of a white man with a white family as well as a colored family. I ain't saying she a gold digger, but she ain't fucking with no broke nigga. In this concubine, the father, being a man of means and influence, defied public sentiment and held family number one in servile submission. But his influence did not stop there. He would have understood that his mistress must not be churched, but rather be regarded as a leading spirit at the church to which she belonged, and which he gave her means to liberally support. If he had power enough to enslave his own legitimate family, forcing even his wife into unwilling silence, and besides, to do so maintain himself in society as to prevent a general protest, it is not to be wondered at that the colored community, dependent perilous, would also hold its peace. In other words, if he could hold his white wife in silence, black folks wasn't going to say nothing because he bought them out. The white father had made no provision for his colored family. So in this case, that's what he's talking about. I wanted to be somebody in some account. I was ashamed of my black family background. I hated that my mother did not marry a colored man and let me live like other folks with a father. And if he did not make much, he could spend that with us. In other words, she would rather be broke and black than be more well off and be mixed and kind of like an outcast. I despised my white father and his folks. That's like a mulattoes rebelled. I might have loved him if he had noticed and treated us like other folks. His white wife died after a while, but she never fussed, as I know of, about his colored family. He had large children, some grown. He did not stay at home. He would have the work done by Negro slaves. He had lots of slaves and families of slaves. He must have had, with the children, 50 or 75 slaves in all. He was right good to them. He would eat at my mother. He would look at this. Look at this. A lot of women say that the black women were raped by these people. Okay, but listen to this. I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I'm saying a lot of women ignore stuff like this. And I'm not saying that this is actually accurate. Okay, what I'm saying is I've heard stuff like this before. He would eat at my mother's house. She called him the man. The man. We called him the man. You think black men invented that, right? He would come in at bedtime, and even before his wife died, he would come in and stay with my mother all night and get up and go to his house the next morning. His children despised us, and I despised them, and all their folks, and I despised him. We had to work hard, get no education, and but little to live on. He had plenty of property, but didn't give mother one thing. Her uncle gave her a home and a field that we had to work it. In other words, at the end of the day, after the white man left, the good white man left them with nothing. Guess who had to come back and support him? Black man. The disgust which this woman felt toward her home life caused her to leave it and establish one based upon conventional moral standards. Referring to her home, she said, "It was so ugly and common that I meant to get married and leave that hateful place. It is true I loved the man I married, but listen to this, but I had as much in mind in getting married to leave that place as I had in marrying for love." I'm going to let that sit. Draw from it what you will. The association between white men and colored women in this community has been on a larger scale than in most southern communities. It is similar to many other areas in the South where there has been a long history of such association dating from slavery. Just as the phenomenon in the community has declined because of the growing sentiment against it on part of blacks and whites. In other words, both blacks and whites wanted to separate. It wasn't one or the other. And still today, that is the case. It has decreased in other areas of the South. Let us turn our attention to these women in their role of mothers and as heads of their families. Some of the separated and widowed in Issaquah County in 1910 had given birth to as many as 20 children or more. Even among those who had only irregular relations with men, there were women from 10 to 12 children. Didn't take much. But the actual number of children in these families is often small because of numerous miscarriages and stillbirths and high infant mortality. I was just talking about that with somebody about the high infant mortality amongst black folks. Otherwise, because the fertility rate for black people during that time was like 8 or 9. And that's even with stillbirths. The following case of a woman who had 2 stillbirths and 3 miscarriages was not unusual for some women. Had lost as many as 9 or 10 children as far as stillbirths. Had to do with nutrition. This woman had no conception of her age, for she thought that she might be around about 20, although she later said that her husband had been dead for 20 years. Okay, she could have been lying. She was living in a one-room shack covered with an iron sheet, tin roof, with a daughter's illegitimate 12-year-old son and her own illegitimate 14-year-old daughter. These 2 children were helping her to hoe and plow a one-horse farm on halves instead of attending school. The family was receiving an advance of like $4 a month. Another daughter, who had taken sick with misery in the head and breast, died suddenly during the past year. The mother tried to get a doctor, but she said concerning her landlord, "This white man don't give you a doctor like talking." In other words, the white man talked about it, but wasn't going to get her a doctor. Although it was difficult to get a clear history of her pregnancy and children, it appeared that she had had 3 children while married and 3 illegitimate children after the death of her husband. That's common. 2 of these latter children were stillborn. In addition, she had 3 miscarriages. The stillbirths and miscarriages were evidently due to syphilitic infection since she showed a positive Wassermann reaction. I don't know how he knows that, but this woman had her children. This woman and her children had been on the present location for 3 years, and although she had moved away from her former landlord because she got tired of working for nothing, she hadn't seen a nickel for a year. With her advance of $4 a month, she and her children were living on dry meat and cornbread, and an occasional dinner of greens from her garden on Sunday. Her situation was not unlike that of many other women who were heads of families. The struggle of these women to get a living for themselves and children who are dependent upon them is bound up in the plantation system in the South. Most of the mothers, as we have seen, are tenants, and many of the relatively large group of unknown home tenure are either living with their parents who are tenants or are themselves mere farm laborers. They work from year to year on halves and are supposed to pay a stipulated amount of cotton and receive in return an advance in food and occasionally clothes at the store. Mothers living with their parents and mothers with grown sons to aid them are able to work larger farms than women depending solely on their own labor. Consequently, mothers with young children are generally only able to work a patch comprising 4 to 6 acres. The advances in food, which are often consist of cornmeal and fat bacon, I remember that because my mother told me about that, are correspondingly small. They supplement with vegetables from their gardens, which the dry weather doesn't when the dry weather does not destroy them. As a result of this restricted diet, we find both mothers and children suffer from pellagra. Statistics indicate that 8 Negroes in Macon County died in 1930 of pellagra, but we know little concerning the numerous cases that did not result in death. One scarcely could find a more depressing picture of abject poverty and human misery than presented by a young black woman who had 2 illegitimate children by different fathers. It's not new, folks. Living in one-room shack on a plantation in Alabama, not many miles from Tuskegee Institute. The father of one child somewhere over the creek, while the father of the other was in Montgomery County or somewhere. One child evidently died of undernourishment, that happens all the time, and neglect. The young mother sat on a broken stool in the middle of her room, furnished only with an iron cot covered with filthy rags. From her dried breasts, a baby half strangled by whooping cough was trying to draw nourishment. Barefooted and clothed only in a cotton waist and dress pinned about her, she was rocking her child as her body swayed listlessly to an inarticulate sing-song tune. On the cold embers in the fireplace lay a skillet containing the remnants of cornbread made only with water, because the landlord refused fat meat as part of her advance. That same morning, he had driven her with blows from a stick. The same morning, he had driven her with blows from her sick child to work in the field. Not all mothers with children depending upon them for support sink to the level of poverty and misery of the woman portrayed above. Although as tenants they receive no accounting from their landlords, many of them manage to get adequate clothing and food of sufficient variety to keep them in health. The plantation area, the relatively few owners are better off so far as the necessities of life are concerned, but the ownership of land is not always infallible sign of independence and comfort. System of credit and the relations of races in the former stronghold of slavery caused even landowning mothers to lead a precarious existence. In regions like the North Carolina county outside of the area where the agriculture is still dominated by the plantation system, home ownership signifies much more independence and comfortable living. No single crop dominates the agricultural activities, and consequently, even during times of economic stress, there may be an abundance of food for consumption. Moreover, in situations like that in North Carolina County where colored women have lived with white men, the struggle for existence have been relieved by the provision which the white fathers often made for their concubines and children. The maternal family is not held together solely by cooperative activities incident to farming. It is also a natural organization for response. Let that sink in. Although some women, after a brief marriage career, return to their mothers' households in order to work with them at farming, many others return to the family group for satisfactions of an emotional nature. There was, for instance, a 38-year-old woman who had left her husband after 5 years of marriage because she got tired of staying with him and preferred to be with mama and them. She was working a 2-horse farm with her brother, who took care of her until the settlement was made at the end of the year. She received nothing at the end of the year. That she received nothing at the end of the year was of no importance to her as long as she lived with her mother and her brother and sister. The same valuation she placed upon the intimate, sympathetic context afforded the family group was expressed by a man when he remarked, "I'm rich when you have mother and father, you're rich." In fact, in the relatively isolated world of these black peasants, note that word, black peasants, life is still largely organized on the basis of the personal and sympathetic relations existing between members of various family groups. As a rule, the mothers show a strong attachment for their children. This is evident even when young mothers whose offspring could be mistaken for younger brothers or sisters and are frequently regarded as such. Let that sink in. In fact, in this world where illegitimate, intimate, and personal relationships count for so much, the relation between mother and child is the most vital and is generally recognized as the most fundamental. Remember, I just said that. The rumor that even a starving mother was giving up her children was received by some women as an unpardonable crime against the natural dictates of the human heart. Black women will drag their babies through hell because it is inconceivable in their cultural mind to actually give up her children no matter what. Doesn't matter how she treats them, doesn't matter what condition they're in, doesn't matter about their future. In a black woman's mind, it is unpardonable to give up her children. She'll be looked at by other women like shit. The intense emotional interdependence between mother and child that one so often finds is encouraged by a long nursing period. According to their own testimony, some women have nursed their children until they were like 3 or 4 years old. In fact, I had a girlfriend that actually did that. Of course, these elemental expressions of love and solicitude for their offspring are often detrimental to the welfare of the children. Many a woman who just lives and works to feed her children will give her child meat and bread when it is a few days old. This is done, they say, to strengthen their stomachs. When one mother pointed to her overfed 19-year-old daughter as proof of the efficacy of such treatment, she never thought of the possible relation of such treatment to the death of 10 of her children during infancy. That's very true. The dependence of the child upon the mother, who is the supreme authority in the household, often creates a solidarity of feeling and sentiment that makes daughters reluctant to leave home with their husbands. Listen to this. I'm going to read this again. The dependence of child upon mother, who is the supreme authority in the household, often creates a solidarity of feeling and sentiment that makes daughters reluctant to leave home with their husbands and bring sons back from their wanderings. During the World War, Negro soldiers who had been drafted in these rural areas and sent to camps often complained in the manner of children of being torn from their mothers. Gynocracy, folks. The mothers on their part show equally strong attachment for their grown sons and daughters. The reason which mothers frequently give for not permitting their daughters to marry the fathers of their illegitimate children is that they are unwilling to part with their daughters. Let that sink in. No matter how long a wandering son or daughter has been away from home, mothers rejoice in their return, and if they hear that their children are sick, they will make great sacrifices to bring them back in order that they may have the ministrations that only a mother can give, or that they may die in the arms of the one who bore them. As a rule, where we find mothers who do not want their children or neglect them, a sympathetic basis of family relations has been destroyed. Through the mobility of the population of life and labor, have made children a burden and a hardship. The isolation of these simple communities is broken down, and overproduction in agriculture is sending women and girls to seek a living in town. So it's not just the basis of they wanted to leave. If they wanted to feed themselves, they had to flee just like the men did. The old relations and traditional values are being destroyed, and new wishes, generally indicating an individualization of life pattern, are becoming dominant. Sometimes children are left at home to be cared for by grandmothers. So it wasn't just so nobody talks about the women leaving the children with grandmothers. It's always the men deserting. In spite of these changes, a large proportion of each generation of Negro mothers in the rural areas continue to bear patiently the burden of motherhood and assume responsibility for the support of their children. Their daughters still follow in look at this. Check this out. Still today, their daughters still follow in their footsteps, bring their offspring to the maternal household. Then these mothers are elevated to the dignity of grandmothers, a position which gives them a peculiar authority in family relations, places upon the responsibility for keeping the kindred together. Madeira or Madeira. Why do you think black women love Madeira so much? Because she plays the matriarchal grandmother that is in the psyche of the culture of black women. It's not rocket science, folks. That's the end of the chapter. So we still have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to riff. I'm not going to take the whole hour. What I'm saying is, Mr. Brown, you ignored this chapter. In fact, there's 3 more that are similar to this one. I just picked this one out. You pick a 700-page book. You take a chapter, or not even a chapter, a paragraph that suits your wishes or suits your narrative, and that's what you pull out. And then you talk about this is representative of the whole book. And you use Moynihan's name to actually legitimize what you're saying. In other words, if Moynihan thought enough to actually use this particular book or use this guy's studies, which he did, then what you're saying must be what he meant. This is the real reason that Moynihan actually used the book. And this is something that I found that is a thread through Du Bois, through Frazier. I can't remember the other dude's name that actually wrote a book, through Wilson, through Moynihan, and through other people that actually pointed this very thing out. There's tons of books about this. I'm not saying that black women are to blame for the broken culture that is the black community. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that what women want to deny is that there is a matriarchy or a gynocracy, as I put it, in the black community as a cultural pattern. Moynihan said exactly the same thing. It's a cultural pattern. It's a cultural pattern that was incompatible with the dominant society. So what they tried to do in the Moynihan report or in the civil rights is actually uh, adjust the black community to fit the patriarchal pattern that was in the white community. Now the white feminists wanted gynocracy. In fact, they wanted to replicate exactly what the pattern that black women have set, because for them this works. They want something like this or something that's similar to it. So the white feminists are all in on this. So to say that black men have a patriarchal bent or a patriarchal pattern that has never existed, it has never existed. I don't care what people say, it's never existed. Now you might have different people that that look like it's a patriarchal pattern, but it's not, because it still persists today. And I hear it too much. I hear elements of the matriarchal pattern today. I mean, today, my neighbor, when they say that you need to send girls to school because they need to take care of their children. Now, white people say, I need to send the girl to school so she can find a husband to take care of her and her children. That matriarchal cultural thinking still exists today. Today. And I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, because it's not right or wrong. If you're going to have a pattern, make the pattern that works for people and not a pattern that doesn't work for people. In this culture, in this environment within the United States, the gynocracy pattern does not really work very well. And you see that when you go to an urban area. The reason you go to an urban area and it doesn't work because a matriarchy or a gynocracy depends on the clan. It's hard to have a clan in an urban area. It's really difficult. It's hard to have a nuclear patriarchal family in an urban area. It's really difficult. That's how come you have so much divorce. So what Moynihan wanted to do is give the men the dominant financial position so that the women would have no choice but to accept a patriarchy. And once they accepted the patriarchy, then they will actually be they could actually more easily be assimilated into the white man's world. The reason that black women cannot blend in a white man's world that easily, the reason that the marriage rate is so low marriage rate is so low for interracial marriages is because of this. Because this gynocracy thinking, this matriarchal pattern still exists. You can't get rid of it. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It is what it is. Black women black men don't understand themselves, but black women especially don't understand themselves, because you listen to white people and they're lying to you. And no woman worth her salt wants to investigate this so they can actually fix what's wrong. Because nobody wants to admit that this goes on. So they cover this up. I've heard a woman on a panel actually notice what was going on and still made excuses that it was a black man's fault. The standard excuse that it is a black man's fault. That's the standard excuse. If black men didn't want it to go on, it wouldn't go on, which is not true. It's never been true. Black men have never had control of their families, ever. 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 Because number one, the black men, one couldn't, and number two, the supreme authority is the white man. So if a black woman was dissatisfied with her husband, she'd go get the white man and have him hauled off. In fact, I had one person in my comment section, I might even read the comment later on, where he actually said it. He said it because he said he was raised in Alabama and he knows people that in the old times, and he as a kid, because he's an old man and he was a kid during those times. He tells he's saying exactly the same thing that I'm saying. And I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. What I'm saying is we need to dig in and dig out the truth so we can fix this shit. If we're going to fix it, you know what? To be perfectly honest, I don't really think we're going to fix it. I think our dysfunction will continue. And eventually what's going to happen is white people are actually going to do what they're doing now. They're going to push you into the white areas. They're going to pacify you, and eventually they're going to admix with you. So in 3 generations, there won't be enough black people to even concern about. There will be no black community in 3 generations. None. There will be no black community in 3 generations. It'll be gone. Now, black people have to decide whether they want a black community or not. Because as a pragmatic individual, I really don't give a shit one way or the other. Because not a goddamn thing I can do about it. And I really don't think black people really want a black community. I think them holding on to their own cultural identity is important as long as they don't have to do any work. When it comes down to the bare bones, where I'm going to have to keep the black community strong and independent and successful, I think because black people have been brainwashed and socialized to think white, I don't think that is even possible anymore, in my personal opinion. I have a whole lot of people in the conscious community that disagree with me. And I'm good with that. I can see then their disagreement is valid. It's just my personal opinion that the black community will probably not survive. If I was a betting man, probably not survive. Now, I hope that I'm wrong. I really hope that I'm wrong, but I doubt that I am. Anyway, with that, I'm going to end this a little early. I'm not going to give you the whole hour. So this is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one.